Welcome back to Horrifying Stories. Halloween is a widely celebrated holiday that falls on October 31st each year. It is a time for costume parties, creative decorations, and of course, trick-or-treating. However, in 1974, what was supposedly a fun night for the O'Brien family quickly turned into their worst nightmare, when 8-year-old Timothy suddenly died that night, just 30 minutes after he ate a candy from his stash of treats. This is his horrifying story. Viewer discretion is advised. On the night of October 31, 1974, kids in Deer Park, Texas were out in the streets, going house to house, knocking on doors asking for candies. One of the families who were out that night were the O'Briens. Ronald Clark O'Brien accompanied his 8-year-old son Timothy and 5-year-old daughter Elizabeth, trick-or-treating together with their neighbor Jim Bates and his son. The kids were enjoying their walk, looking at decorations, knocking on doors of neighboring houses and collecting their candies, excited to of course eat the candies they had gathered. As they went along, they approached a particular house where all the lights were switched off. It's as if nobody was home. The kids at this point decided to still try and knock, as some of the previous houses that didn't have any decorations or lights still opened their doors and handed out candies. O'Brien went along with the kids and knocked on the door. They were knocking and knocking, but nobody opened the door. So the kids decided to just proceed to the next house, and Jim went along with them. But O'Brien stayed for a while, hoping someone would open the door eventually. As the kids went to the next house, O'Brien caught up from behind them, calling them as he waved some Pixy Stix tube, a powdered sour candy. Apparently, after knocking a few more times, somebody opened the door in that dark house and gave him some candies. O'Brien went on and handed each of the kids the Pixy Stix tube, one for each kid in their group. After a long night of trick-or-treating, O'Brien and his children finally came back home. Timothy and Elizabeth were very excited, showing off and comparing the sweets they have collected that night. The two of them were asking their dad if they could eat their candies, but it was already getting late and O'Brien did not really like the idea of his kids eating candies at night and getting hyperactive. However, the kids begged and begged their dad, and so O'Brien finally gave in. His condition was for Timothy and Elizabeth to pick out just one candy for that night. Timothy picked the Pixy Stix tube from his basket of candies. He asked his dad to help him open the plastic tube, and after O'Brien opened it, Timothy quickly poured the powdered candy into his mouth. As soon as the powdered candy reached his taste buds, Timothy immediately coughed and complained that the candy tasted very bitter. O'Brien immediately got a Kool-Aid juice and handed it to Timothy to wash off the bitter taste brought about by the candy. Right after that incident, Timothy immediately felt nauseous and started to vomit. Then, all of a sudden, he went limp. Alarmed, O'Brien and his wife immediately rushed young Timothy to the hospital. Tragically, before they could even reach the hospital, Timothy had already succumbed to death, approximately just an hour after he ate the Pixy Stix. Pasadena Police Department called Harris County Prosecutor Mike Hinton and reported the incident regarding the boy's passing. Hinton rushed to the hospital and saw the boy's lifeless body. Wanting to start the investigation right away, he called Dr. Joseph Jakimczyk, the chief medical examiner in Harris County, and told him what had happened to Timothy. Dr. Jakimczyk asked Hinton to smell the area of the mouth, and Hinton told him that it smelled like a scent of almond. Without second thoughts, Dr. Jakimczyk immediately told Hinton that it was cyanide. An autopsy was conducted right away, and the medical examiner confirmed that young Timothy had consumed cyanide. He had consumed enough cyanide to kill 2 adults. Investigators also found out that the top part of the Pixy Stix that Timothy had eaten has cyanide on it. In fact, the first 2 inches of the powdered candy is nothing but cyanide. With no time to waste, the police officers quickly recovered all the Pixy Stix that the remaining children had in their trick-or-treat baskets. Fortunately, the other children have not eaten them yet. One of the kids was very close to eating the candy, but he was not able to open it. He was found to be sleeping holding the Pixy Stix. Determined to track down the culprit, investigators interviewed O'Brien and was asked if he could point to the house where he got the Pixy Stix. Unfortunately, they went to a lot of houses that night and he could not remember the exact house where he got the Pixy Stix. He also told the investigators that he was not able to see the man's face who handed those candies. He stated that it was dark during that time, and the men just slightly opened the door enough for him to see only the man's hand handing out the candies. O'Brien's memory was not a big help in his son's case, and the investigators were getting frustrated as they had no leads. Police went again to O'Brien's house and asked him to retrace their steps on that Halloween night. This time, the police were pressuring O'Brien more to remember the events that night. O'Brien tried his best to recall the events, and finally, he was able to point out the house where he got the Pixy Stix. Police now had a suspect for this case. The man who owned the house was working in Houston's William Hobby Airport as an air traffic controller. The suspect was not in the house when they went, so police went to where the man was working, arrested him and took him into custody. During the interview of this certain man, investigators found out that the man had a solid alibi on Halloween night. He was working that night and his colleagues and timesheet confirmed that what he said was true. The only people who were in the man's house that night were his wife and daughter. When his family was interrogated, they stated that they ran out of candy early that night and so they turned their lights off so that no trick-or-treaters would knock on their door. And so, with a strong alibi and having no solid evidence, the man was released and the investigation was now back to zero. At this time, Hinton became very suspicious of O'Brien. Investigators began digging into O'Brien's background and his recent activities. What they found out next was highly disturbing. Ronald O'Brien was an optician working at Texas State Optical. He sang in the choir and was a deacon at their local church. Digging into O'Brien's finances, investigators found out that O'Brien was over $100,000 in debt, equivalent to over $600,000 in today's worth. During that time, he was also jumping from one job to another and could not hold a steady income. His car was bound to be repossessed and his house had been foreclosed. Apparently, in January 1974, he had taken a $10,000 policy on each of his children. And then a month before Halloween, he increased it to $20,000. This is unusually high and it is also uncommon for children to have a life insurance policy. What's more bothersome was in the morning after Timothy's death, as early as around 9 a.m., O'Brien called the insurance company and inquired about collecting the life insurance money for his son. Because of this unusual behavior, investigators were able to secure a search warrant for O'Brien's house. They found a pair of scissors that had a plastic residue consistent with the same material that was on the Pixy Stix plastic tube. Multiple witnesses also spoke of O'Brien's unusual behavior. A college professor told investigators that O'Brien was asking him about cyanide and other types of poisons. He asked what the most lethal poison was. Another person also came up to investigators. The man was working for a chemical company in Houston. He stated that a man wearing a beige or blue smock came into his store and expressed his desire to buy cyanide. But when he found out that the smallest amount he could buy was 5 pounds, he left the store. Although O'Brien was not directly identified because the man from the store could no longer remember the face nor did he ask for his name, the description of the clothes he wore was exactly the same as O'Brien's uniform for work. In court, then 30-year-old O'Brien pleaded not guilty and maintained that the real culprit must be some crazy boogeyman who took advantage of the festive trick-or-treating season to carry out such a crime. Because the technology for DNA testing and contactless debit cards were not yet available during that time, the prosecution team couldn't exactly directly link O'Brien's fingerprints to the scissors that had the cyanide residue, nor could they actually trace his transactions to a purchase of the cyanide. However, many had testified against him, including friends and family. So on June 3, 1975, after 46 minutes of deliberation, the jury pronounced O'Brien to be guilty beyond reasonable doubt for 1 count of capital murder and 4 counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to death by electric chair. Dubbed by the media as Candyman, O'Brien attempted to appeal the jury's decision for almost 10 years, but each attempt failed to reverse his sentence. Thus, on March 31, 1984, Ronald Clark O'Brien was executed at the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville. At that time, electric chair execution had already been stopped as the U.S. Supreme Court deemed it was an inhumane punishment. Instead, O'Brien died by lethal injection. Around 300 people gathered outside the facility's premises awaiting his execution. By 12:48 a.m., he was pronounced dead, and as soon as the people outside heard the news, they victoriously shouted, "Trick or treat," as they threw candy at anti-death penalty protesters around the area. Thank you for making it this far. If you liked this video, please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Feel free to drop your comments down below, including your story suggestions. We'd love to hear from you. Once again, thank you and see you on the next one.